Margaret Sullivan arrives at the upscale restaurant believing she's finally ready to love again, not knowing her dinner companion will abandon her within minutes, leaving her stranded and humiliated. What happens next will restore her faith in human kindness and reveal a connection so genuine it will transform two broken hearts forever. A story that proves love finds us when we least expect it and will make you believe in second chances again. The September rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of La Lumiere, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Margaret Sullivan adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time, her manicured fingers betraying the nervousness she tried so desperately to hide. At 32, she was the youngest CEO in her company's history, commanding boardrooms with the kind of quiet authority that made grown men listen when she spoke. But tonight, sitting alone at table 14, she felt like that awkward teenager, again, the one who'd been stood up at senior prom. The burgundy cocktail dress she'd chosen hung perfectly on her frame, tailored to accommodate the wheelchair she'd called home for the past 3 years. The accident that had stolen her ability to walk had also taken something else, her belief that someone could love all of her, chair and all. Tonight was supposed to change that. She glanced at her phone. 7:47 p.m. Richard was 17 minutes late. "Can I refresh your water, miss?" The waiter's voice carried that polite concern that comes after the third refill. "Please," Margaret smiled, the same practiced expression she wore during quarterly reports. "I'm sure he's just caught in traffic." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her chest like a physical ache. Her best friend Sarah had set this up, swearing that Richard was different, that he wouldn't care about the chair. He's successful, charming, and specifically said physical limitations don't matter to him, Sarah had insisted. "Just what you need, Maggie." What she needed. As if she were broken goods requiring special handling. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of couples sharing intimate dinners, the soft clink of silverware against china, creating a symphony of normal life. The kind of life she'd once taken for granted. A life where walking into a restaurant didn't require calculating wheelchair accessibility, where first dates didn't come with the terror of rejection once her condition became apparent. Her phone buzzed. Finally. Richard. "Hey." Something came up. "Rain check?" That was it. No apology, no explanation, just 11 words that confirmed what she'd feared since the moment she'd wheeled through those doors. Margaret stared at the message, her chest tightening with familiar humiliation. She'd been foolish to hope, foolish to believe that. "Mom?" A different voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find a man standing beside her table, and for a moment her breath caught. Not because he was handsome, though the strong jawline and kind eyes certainly didn't hurt, but because of how he looked at her, directly at her face, not at the chair, not with pity or awkward curiosity, but with genuine concern. He wore work clothes, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain, and there was motor oil under his fingernails that he hadn't quite managed to scrub away. Everything about him screamed blue collar, a stark contrast to the restaurant's upscale atmosphere. Several other diners were already glancing their way with the kind of subtle disapproval that money bought. "I'm sorry to bother you," he continued, his voice carrying a slight Brooklyn accent that warmed something inside her chest. "But I couldn't help noticing you've been sitting here alone for a while, and you look like maybe you could use a friend." Margaret's first instinct was to lie, to smile that polished smile and assure him everything was fine. That's what successful CEOs did. They handled problems privately, efficiently, without airing their failures in public. But something in his eyes stopped her. Maybe it was the rain still dripping from his jacket, or the way he'd approached her table without hesitation despite the obvious class divide. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of pretending. "I've been stood up," she said quietly, the admission feeling both liberating and mortifying. His expression darkened, not with pity but with something that looked suspiciously like anger on her behalf. "What kind of idiot stands up a woman like you?" The question hit her unexpectedly. Not a woman in your condition, or someone with your challenges, just a woman like you. When was the last time someone had spoken to her as simply a woman first? Apparently the kind who doesn't want to be seen with damaged goods. she replied, immediately regretting the bitter edge to her voice. Damaged goods. He looked genuinely confused. Lady, I don't know what mirror you've been looking in, but the one I'm seeing shows a beautiful woman who deserves a hell of a lot better than whatever asshole just lost his chance. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to such direct compliments, especially not from strangers. Especially not from attractive strangers who looked at her like she was worth defending. I'm Alex, by the way, he said, extending a hand that was calloused but clean. Alex Rodriguez. I own Rodriguez Auto Shop about 6 blocks from here. Margaret Sullivan. She took his hand, noting how he shook it firmly, treating her like an equal rather than something fragile. And thank you, but you don't need to play white knight. I'm perfectly capable of handling rejection. I'm sure you are, Alex replied, but he made no move to leave. Mind if I ask what you do? You've got that look about you, like you're used to being in charge. Despite herself, Margaret found her lips curving into a genuine smile for the first time that evening. CEO of Sullivan & Associates, marketing firm. Alex whistled low. Damn. So not only is this guy an idiot for standing you up, he's also missing out on what sounds like fascinating conversation. He paused, glancing around the restaurant. Look, I know I'm probably breaking about 17 social rules here, but would you mind if I sat down, just until you're ready to leave? Nobody should have to sit alone in a place like this. Margaret studied him carefully. Every logical part of her brain screamed that this was inappropriate. She didn't know this man, didn't know his intentions, and accepting company from a stranger, especially one so obviously outside her usual social circle, was the kind of impulsive decision she'd built her career on avoiding. But she was tired of being logical, tired of being careful, tired of protecting herself from disappointment by never taking risks. I suppose that would be nice, she said finally. Alex's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance, and Margaret felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. He settled into the chair across from her, looking slightly out of place among the crystal and fine china, but somehow making it work through sheer confidence. So, he said, leaning back in his chair, tell me about the worst business meeting you've ever had. I bet it's better than my worst customer story. And just like that, Margaret found herself laughing, not the polite laughter she used in board meetings, but real, genuine laughter that bubbled up from somewhere she'd forgotten existed. You want to trade war stories? Lady, I once had a customer who insisted his car's engine problems were caused by his ex-wife putting a curse on it, swore he needed an exorcism, not a tune-up. Did you perform the exorcism? Alex grinned. I told him I'd bless the engine block while I replaced his spark plugs, charged him extra for the spiritual consultation. Margaret laughed again, and she realized with surprise that her shoulders had relaxed for the first time all evening. I had a client who wanted us to market his new line of edible underwear as gourmet dining experiences. He was completely serious. Please tell me you took that account. We did not, though we did refer him to a company that specialized in niche products. They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, trading increasingly ridiculous stories from their respective careers. Alex had a way of listening that made Margaret feel heard, not just her words, but the person behind them. He asked follow-up questions, laughed at her jokes, and treated her insights about business with genuine interest. It wasn't until the waiter approached for the 4th time that Margaret realized they'd been talking for over an hour. I'm so sorry, she said, suddenly self-conscious. You probably have somewhere to be and I'm monopolizing your evening. Actually, Alex said, his voice taking on a slightly different quality, I was supposed to meet someone here tonight too. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Of course he had plans. Of course this was just a brief charitable interlude before he went on with his real life. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. A blind date, he continued, and something in his tone made her look up. Set up by my sister. She insisted I needed to meet this successful businesswoman who'd be perfect for me. He paused, meeting her eyes. Someone named Margaret Sullivan. The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. You're Richard? Ricardo Rodriguez, Alex said quietly. But yeah, I go by Richard on dating profiles. Makes things easier sometimes. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly vulnerable. I got here early and was working up the courage to approach your table when I saw you checking your phone with that worried expression. I figured if I was late, the least I could do was make sure you were okay. Margaret's mind struggled to process this information. The charming, successful man Sarah had described, the one who supposedly wouldn't care about her wheelchair, was sitting right here, had been sitting here for an hour, talking to her, laughing with her, making her feel more comfortable than she had in months. But you didn't know who I was when you came over, she said slowly. No, Alex admitted. I just saw a beautiful woman who looked like she needed a friend. He leaned forward, his voice growing earnest. And I'm glad I didn't know, because it gave us a chance to just be ourselves. No expectations, no pressure, just two people talking. Margaret felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, though whether from relief or embarrassment, or something else entirely she couldn't say. So when you said Richard was an idiot, I was talking about myself, Alex said with a rueful smile. And I was right. I almost chickened out of this whole thing 3 times on the way over here. Your sister warned me about the wheelchair, said some guys had problems with it, and I spent the entire drive here wondering if I was one of those assholes. And now, Alex's gaze traveled deliberately down to her chair, and then back to her face. Now I'm wondering why anyone would care about anything except getting to know the woman sitting in it. The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's breath catch. She'd spent 3 years bracing herself for rejection, preparing speeches about how her disability didn't define her, anticipating the awkward moment when dates realized what they were getting into. But Alex had already seen her chair, had already spent an hour with her, and was looking at her like she was exactly what he'd hoped to find. Sarah didn't tell me you were a mechanic, Margaret said finally. Does that matter? The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond career choices. Margaret thought about her world, board meetings and charity galas, country club dinners and private jets. Then she looked at the man across from her, with his calloused hands and genuine smile, who'd spent the last hour making her laugh without once making her feel like she needed to. Prove her worth. It matters that you make an honest living doing something you're good at, she said. It matters that you saw someone in distress and decided to help instead of walking away. It matters that you've spent the last hour treating me like I'm interesting instead of inspirational. Alex's smile was soft and real. You are interesting. And beautiful. And funny as hell. He paused. And I'd really like to take you on a proper date if you're willing to give a grease monkey a chance. Margaret felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger this time. What did you have in mind? Well, I was thinking we could start with dinner, somewhere less intimidating than this place. Maybe Tony's Diner down the street. Best meatloaf in Brooklyn, and they make a killer apple pie. Alex's eyes sparkled with mischief. Plus, the tables are definitely wheelchair accessible, and nobody's going to judge my table manners. You want to take the CEO of a major marketing firm to a diner? Margaret asked, raising an eyebrow. I want to take Margaret Sullivan, the woman who just spent an hour making me laugh harder than I have in months. Somewhere we can both relax and be ourselves. The CEO thing is impressive, but it's not why I'm interested. The honesty in his voice undid something in Margaret's chest. Some knot of tension she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. When was the last time someone had wanted to know her rather than network with her? When had anyone looked past her accomplishments to see the person underneath? Tony's Diner it is, she said. Alex's grin could have powered the entire restaurant. Really? Really? Though I should warn you, I have very high standards for apple pie. Tony's will exceed every expectation you've ever had about pie, Alex promised, standing and offering her his arm. Trust me. As they made their way toward the exit, Margaret caught sight of their reflection in the restaurant's dark windows, him in his work clothes walking beside her chair, both of them smiling like teenagers with their first crush. They looked nothing like the power couples that usually grace these establishments, nothing like the matching success stories she'd always imagined herself part of. They looked happy. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the sidewalk, leaving the streets gleaming with reflected streetlight. Alex had insisted on settling her bill at La Lumiere despite her protests, an old-fashioned gesture that should have felt condescending but somehow felt caring instead. "My car's just around the corner," Alex said, then stopped. "Actually, do you drive? I realize I just assumed—" "I drive," Margaret assured him. "Hand controls, my car's in the parking structure across the street. Would you prefer to drive yourself? I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." "Alex," Margaret interrupted gently, "it's okay. I'd rather ride with—" "Oh, if that's all right. We can come back for my car later." The relief on his face was endearing. "Of course, I don't want to mess this up." "You're not messing anything up," Margaret said, and meant it. "You're actually doing remarkably well for someone who claims to be an idiot." Alex laughed, the sound echoing off the wet pavement. "Give me time. I'm sure I'll find a way to prove that assessment correct." His car turned out to be an immaculately maintained 1967 Camaro, painted a deep blue that gleamed under the streetlights. Margaret whistled appreciatively. "Now this is beautiful." "She's my baby," Alex said proudly, running his hand along the hood. "Bought her as a rust bucket when I was 19 and spent 3 years rebuilding her from the ground up." He paused, looking suddenly uncertain. "The passenger seat adjusts, but getting in might be—" "Alex," Margaret's voice was firm but kind, "I've been managing my own mobility for 3 years. I know what I can and can't do. Right now I can definitely get into that gorgeous car of yours." The transfer was easier than she'd expected, Alex holding her chair steady, but otherwise letting her handle the logistics herself. By the time she was settled in the passenger seat, the leather warm against her back and the faint scent of motor oil and pine air freshener surrounding her, she felt more relaxed than she had in months. "Comfortable?" Alex asked as he slid behind the wheel. "Very." Margaret ran her hand along the dashboard, appreciating the restoration work. "You rebuilt this yourself? Every bolt, every wire?" Pride colored his voice as he started the engine, which purred to life with a satisfying rumble. "It was my therapy after my dad died. Something about working with my hands fixing something that was broken. It helped." Margaret heard the deeper story in those words. Loss, grief, the need for purpose and healing. "How long ago did you lose him?" 5 years. Alex pulled into traffic, his hands steady on the wheel. "Heart attack, he was only 58. He glanced at her. "The shop was his. Started it when he came from Puerto Rico in the 70s. Built it from nothing. When he died, I almost sold it. Didn't think I was smart enough to keep it running." "But you did." "Yeah, I did. Turns out Dad taught me more than I realized." Alex's smile was tinged with sadness. "He always said honest work and treating people right were the only things that mattered. Everything else was just noise." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than attraction. She understood loss, understood the weight of expectations, the fear of not being enough to fill the spaces left by tragedy. "My parents died when I was 25, she said quietly. "Car accident. That's actually how I ended up running the company so young. It was theirs before it was mine." Alex glanced at her, his eyes soft with understanding. "That's a lot of responsibility to take on so young." "I was angry for a long time," Margaret admitted. "Angry that they left me. Angry that everyone expected me to just step into their shoes and carry on like nothing had changed. I threw myself into work because it was easier than dealing with the grief. And then? Then I had my own accident 3 years ago." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "Drunk driver ran a red light. Suddenly I had a whole new set of things to be angry about." They'd reached Tony's Diner, a classic silver railway car that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1950s. Alex parked but made no move to get out, letting the engine idle as they sat in the warm darkness of the car. "Can I ask what happened?" he said gently. "You don't have to tell me if—" "Spinal cord injury, T12 complete." The medical terms felt clinical, safer than the emotional reality. "I was in the hospital for 4 months, rehab for another 6. Lost my fiancé about 3 months in." Alex's jaw tightened. "He left while you were in rehab?" He said he couldn't handle it, that it wasn't what he'd signed up for. Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Funny thing is, I wasn't even surprised. Deep down, I think I knew he was only with me because of who I was, not who I am. The successful girlfriend looked good at business functions. What a fucking coward, Alex said quietly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. The raw anger in his voice surprised her. Most people offered platitudes about her being better off without him, or assured her she'd find someone else someday. But Alex sounded genuinely furious on her behalf, like her ex-fiancé's betrayal was a personal affront. I spent a long time thinking he was right, though, Margaret continued, that I really wasn't what anyone would sign up for. That the best I could hope for was someone who'd settle for damaged goods. Alex turned off the engine and faced her fully. Margaret, look at me. She did, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. You are not damaged goods. You are not something someone settles for. You are a strong, intelligent, beautiful woman who survived something terrible and built an incredible life anyway. His voice was fierce, certain. Any man who can't see that isn't worth 5 minutes of your time. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes again. She'd heard similar words from therapists, from friends, from family, but somehow coming from this man, this near stranger who had no obligation to comfort her, they felt true in a way they never had before. How do you do that? She whispered. Do what? Make me believe it. Alex reached over and gently touched her hand. Because I'm looking at you with clear eyes. No history, no preconceptions, no agenda. Just seeing you as you are right now, in this moment. He smiled softly. And what I see is extraordinary. Margaret felt something. Inside her chest crack open. Something she'd kept carefully sealed for 3 years. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, beautiful hope. Come on, Alex said, squeezing her hand gently. Let me show you the best apple pie in Brooklyn. Tony's diner was exactly what Margaret had expected. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and a counter where a handful of regulars nursed coffee and argued about baseball. The smell of grease and coffee and something indefinably homey filled the air. It was the complete opposite of every restaurant she'd been to in the past 5 years, and she loved it immediately. Alex, a heavy-set man behind the counter called out as they entered. You brought a date. It's about time. Tony, meet Margaret, Alex said, not seeming at all embarrassed by the attention. Margaret, this is Tony Castellano, who makes the best meatloaf in 5 boroughs and never lets me forget it. Pleasure to meet you, sweetheart, Tony said warmly, wiping his hands. On his apron. Any friend of Alex's gets the VIP treatment. You want the corner booth, more space for your chair? Margaret appreciated that he addressed her directly and matter-of-factly acknowledged her wheelchair without making it a big deal. That would be wonderful, thank you. The corner booth was perfect, spacious enough for her to wheel up to the table comfortably with a view of the entire diner. Alex slid in across from her, looking completely at home in the casual atmosphere. So, he said, picking up the well-worn menu. Meatloaf, or are you feeling adventurous? Definitely adventurous, Margaret replied. Though I'm trusting your judgment here. I haven't eaten at a diner in, well, probably since college. Seriously, what kind of restaurants do you usually go to? The kind with more forks than necessary and wine that costs more than most people's car payments, Margaret said dryly. Business dinners mostly. I can't remember the last time I went. Somewhere just because the food was good. Alex looked genuinely sad at that. That's terrible. Food should be about more than business. It should be about comfort, about sharing something good with people you care about. A young waitress with bright pink hair and a name tag reading Sophia appeared at their table. Hey Alex, the usual? Make it 2, Alex said. And Sophia. We're going to need 2 slices of apple pie after. Margaret's never had Tony's pie before. Sophia's eyes widened in mock horror. Never had Tony's pie? Girl, you're in for a religious experience. She grinned at Margaret. Alex bringing you here is basically him proposing. This is his special place. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. At the same time, Alex protested. Sophia, you're going to scare her away. Am I wrong, though? Sophia asked with a raised eyebrow. Alex looked across the table at Margaret, his expression suddenly serious. No, he said quietly. You're not wrong. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret felt her heart rate accelerate. They'd known each other for all of 3 hours, but something about the way Alex was looking at her made her believe he was already thinking in terms of forever. "The usual coming right up," Sophia said with a knowing smile, retreating to give them privacy. "So what's the usual?" Margaret asked, partly to break the tension and partly because she was genuinely curious. "Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans and gravy," Alex replied. "Comfort food at its finest, nothing fancy, just good." "Sounds perfect." They fell back into easy conversation, Alex telling her more about the auto shop and his dreams of expanding into classic car restoration. Margaret sharing stories about some of her more interesting clients and the challenges of running a business in such a competitive industry. The food arrived, perfectly seasoned meatloaf with creamy potatoes and vegetables that actually tasted like vegetables, rather than whatever passed for food at most business dinners. "This is incredible," Margaret said around a bite of mashed potatoes. "I forgot food could taste like this." "You mean like food?" "I mean like love," Margaret replied without thinking, then immediately felt her face burn. No, I know what you mean," Alex said gently. "Tony's wife, Rosa, taught him to cook. She used to say that food made without love was just fuel, but food made with love could heal anything." "Used to?" "She died 2 years ago. Cancer." Alex's expression grew sad. "Tony almost closed the diner after she passed. Couldn't see the point in cooking if she wasn't there to taste it. It took months for us to convince him that keeping her recipes alive was how he could honor her memory." Margaret looked around the diner with new eyes, seeing the faded photographs of a smiling woman behind the counter, the care with which Tony prepared. Each plate, the way the regular customers treated him like family rather than just the guy who served their food. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "Tony says Rosa would have loved you," Alex said suddenly. "He doesn't even know me." "He knows you made me smile more in one evening than I have in months." That would have been enough for her. The apple pie, when it arrived, was indeed a religious experience. Flaky crust that shattered at the touch of a fork. Apples that were perfectly sweet and tart, with just a hint of cinnamon and something else she couldn't identify. "What's the secret ingredient?" Margaret asked after her third bite. "Rosa's recipe," Tony called from behind the counter, apparently having excellent hearing. "But if I told you, I'd have to kill you." "It's cardamom," Alex whispered conspiratorially, "and a tiny bit of vanilla in the crust. But you didn't hear it from me." Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. The combination of good food, easy conversation, and Alex's unwavering attention was intoxicating. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to reveal some fatal flaw or hidden agenda, but as the evening wore on, he only seemed more genuine. "Can I ask you something?" Alex said as they finished their pie. "Of course." "What made you agree to the blind date in the first place? Sarah said you'd been turning them down for months." Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think I was tired. Of being afraid. Tired of letting what happened to me define what I thought was possible." She met his eyes. "I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what if. And now I'm wondering what took me so long to say yes." Alex's smile was radiant. "I'm wondering the same thing." As they prepared to leave the diner, Tony refusing to let them pay and insisting Margaret take an extra slice of pie for later, Margaret realized she didn't want the evening to end. For the first time since her accident, she felt like herself again. Not the CEO, not the disabled woman, not the tragic figure to be pitied or inspired by, but simply Margaret. "Would you like to go for a drive?" Alex asked as they reached his car. "There's a spot by the river where you can see the city lights, nothing fancy, just peaceful." Margaret should have said no. She had an early morning meeting, reports to review, the kind of responsibilities that didn't pause for unexpected romance. But looking at Alex's hopeful expression, she realized she didn't care about any of that. "I'd love to." The drive to the waterfront took them through neighborhoods that showed a different side of Brooklyn, tree-lined streets with brownstones where families sat on stoops despite the late hour, small parks where teenagers gathered around basketball courts, the kind of organic community that money couldn't buy. "You grew up around here?" Margaret asked, watching the world roll by through the Camaro's windows. "About 10 minutes from here," Alex replied. Same house my dad bought when he married my mom. She still lives there, actually. Keeps threatening to downsize but can't bring herself to leave the neighborhood. Are you close with your family? Very. Sometimes too close. My sister Isabella thinks she's my personal dating consultant, and my mom still tries to feed me every time I visit, which is daily. Alex's laugh was warm with affection. They're going to love. You? The casual assumption that she'd meet his family made Margaret's heart skip. She wasn't used to men who thought in terms of integration rather than temporary entertainment. They reached the waterfront park, a small strip of green space with benches facing the East River and the glittering Manhattan skyline beyond. Alex parked and came around to help with her chair, his movements careful but not overly solicitous. They found a spot by the railing where the city lights reflected, in the dark water like scattered diamonds. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, taking in the view. "I come here when I need to think," Alex said, settling on a nearby bench so they were at the same eye level. "Something about seeing the city from this distance puts things in perspective." Margaret looked across the water at the towers of Manhattan, many of which housed offices where she'd conducted business, restaurants where she'd attended countless professional dinners, the whole world of success and achievement that had defined her life for so long. From here it looked small and distant, just lights in the darkness. "Can I tell you something?" she said quietly. "Anything. I've been living in those buildings across the river for so long I forgot there was anything else. Work became everything after my parents died, and then after my accident, I think I used it as armor. If I was successful enough, busy enough, important enough, maybe the other stuff wouldn't matter. And now?" Margaret turned to face him fully. "Now I'm sitting by a river with a man I met 3 hours ago, and I feel more like myself than I have in years. I feel possible again." Alex reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You are possible, Margaret. You're so much more than possible." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the occasional boat pass by and listening to the gentle lap of water against the retaining wall. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd simply existed in a moment without planning the next one, without calculating outcomes or managing expectations. "Alex," she said finally, "I need you to know something." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Okay, I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of hoping this is real. Scared of believing someone could want me the way I am now. I'm scared of getting hurt again, and I'm scared of hurting you if you don't understand what you're getting into." Alex squeezed her hand gently. "What do you think I'm getting into?" "The chair is the least of it," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are days when the pain is so bad, I can barely function. There are medical appointments and insurance battles and a dozen small inconveniences every day that most people never have to think about. There are things I can't do, places I can't go, assumptions people make." "Margaret." Alex's voice was firm but kind. "Look at me." She did, seeing nothing but steady certainty in his dark eyes. "I'm not most people," he said simply. "I don't care about things you can't do. I care about who you are, what you think, how you make me feel when I'm with you. The rest of it, we figure it out together if you'll let me." "What if it's too hard? What if you change your mind?" Alex was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "My dad used to restore classic cars as a hobby," he said finally. "Beautiful machines that had been damaged, neglected, sometimes written off as total losses. You know what he taught me about restoration?" Margaret shook her head. "He said the cars that had been through the most, the ones with the most battle scars and complicated histories, those were the ones worth saving. Not because they were broken, but because they had stories, because they had character that only comes from surviving something difficult." Alex's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "He said those cars, once you brought them back to their full glory, were more beautiful and more valuable than anything that rolled off a factory floor." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks before she could stop them. "Alex, I'm not trying to fix you, Margaret. You're not broken. But I would be honored to be part of your story going forward. Whatever that looks like." The sincerity in his voice undid the last of her defenses. She leaned forward and Alex met her halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and sure and full of promise. When they broke apart, Margaret felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in 3 years. "So what happens now?" she whispered against his lips. "Now we take it one day at a time," Alex replied. "We figure out how to fit our lives together. We meet each other's families and probably drive them crazy with how happy we are. We argue about where to eat dinner and whether to watch baseball or those cooking shows you probably love." Margaret laughed through her tears. "I do love cooking shows." "I knew it. We'll compromise cooking shows during commercial breaks of baseball games." "That's not how compromise works." "We'll figure it out," Alex said with a grin. "We've got time." As they sat there by the water, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The same feeling she'd had when she'd first managed to transfer from her bed to her wheelchair by herself, or when she'd walked into her first board meeting after her accident and realized she was still every bit as capable as before. It was the feeling of possibility expanding, of a future that looked different than what she'd planned, but somehow more beautiful for its unexpectedness. "Alex," she said as they prepared to leave the park. "Yeah? I'm glad you're Ricardo Rodriguez, and not Richard whatever his last name was." Alex's laugh echoed across the water. "Me too, Margaret." "Zalafin, me too." The drive back to Margaret's car gave them time to settle into the comfortable quiet that had developed between them. Alex had turned on the radio softly, and something about the combination of classic rock, the warm car interior, and his presence beside her made Margaret feel more relaxed than she had in months. "So," Alex said as they pulled into the parking structure where she'd left her BMW, "when can I see you again?" Margaret felt that flutter in her chest. "Again. Are you free tomorrow night?" "I'm free whenever you are," Alex replied honestly. "Though I should probably warn you, I'm not much for fancy restaurants. My idea of fine dining is when Tony remembers to put the good napkins out." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "I'm tired of fancy restaurants. What do you do for fun that doesn't involve white tablecloths?" Alex's grin was infectious. "Well, there's a street festival in Little Italy this weekend. Food trucks, live music, the kind of chaos that makes your corporate heart probably seize up in terror." "My corporate heart finds that terrifying and intriguing in equal measure," Margaret laughed. "I'm in." As Alex helped her transfer back to her own car, Margaret marveled at how natural it felt. He held her chair steady without hovering, offered assistance without being presumptuous, and treated the whole process like what it was, a normal part of her routine rather than something dramatic or inspirational. "Drive." "Safe," he said, leaning down to kiss her softly through the open car window. "And Margaret." "Yeah? Thank you for giving us a chance." Margaret watched his taillights disappear into the night traffic before starting her own car, her heart still racing from that simple kiss. As she navigated the familiar route back to her Upper East Side apartment, she found herself seeing the city differently. The streets that had felt like corridors between obligations now seemed full of possibility. Her apartment, when she rolled through the front door, felt different too. The pristine surfaces and carefully curated artwork that had once represented success now seemed cold and impersonal. For the first time, she wondered what Alex would think of the space, whether he'd feel comfortable on her Italian leather furniture or intimidated by the original paintings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Margaret's phone buzzed as she was getting ready for bed. "Alex. Made it home safely. Still can't believe tonight was real. Sweet dreams, beautiful." She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Best night I've had in 3 years. Thank you for seeing me." "Alex, thank you for letting me." Margaret fell asleep with her phone on the pillow beside her, Alex's words echoing in her mind. For the first time since her accident, she went to bed excited about tomorrow. The next morning brought reality crashing back in the form of her assistant Jennifer's voice through the intercom. "Margaret, you have the Hartwell presentation at 9, lunch with the Patterson Group at 12:30, and the quarterly review meeting at 3. Also, Sarah called. She wants to know how the blind date went." Margaret wheeled into her office, the familiar rhythm of business instantly reasserting itself. But something was different. As she reviewed the Hartwell presentation, a campaign for luxury watches that emphasized exclusivity and status. She found herself thinking about Alex's calloused hands and wondering when marketing had become so removed from real life. The demographic we're targeting values prestige above all else, her creative director Marcus was saying. These aren't people who need to know the time, they need others to know they can afford a $40,000 watch. And why do we think that's a good thing? Margaret heard herself ask. The room went quiet. Marcus blinked. I'm sorry? Why are we celebrating the idea that someone would spend $40,000 on a watch when that money could change someone's life? Margaret realized she was voicing thoughts she'd never allowed herself to have before. What does that say about our values as a company? Jennifer, who had been taking notes, looked up with concern. Margaret, are you feeling all right? Margaret paused, considering the question seriously. Was she all right? She was questioning everything she'd built her career on, thinking about a mechanic instead of profit margins, wondering when she'd become someone who saw people only as market segments to be exploited. I'm fine, she said finally. I'm just thinking about our impact differently. Continue with the presentation, Marcus. But as the meeting progressed, Margaret found her attention drifting. Through her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see people walking on the sidewalks below, real people with real lives, not target demographics or consumer profiles. Somewhere out there, Alex was probably already at work, fixing someone's car with the same care and attention he'd shown her the night before. Her phone buzzed with a text. Alex, hope you're having a good morning. Thinking about you. Margaret smiled despite herself, then noticed that everyone in the conference room was staring at her. I'm sorry, she said quickly. What was the question? We were asking if you wanted to approve the additional budget for the celebrity endorsement, Marcus repeated, looking puzzled. The one we discussed last week. Margaret couldn't remember discussing any celebrity endorsement, which was troubling since she prided herself on being completely present in meetings. Send me the details and I'll review them this afternoon, she said, effectively ending the meeting. As her team filed out, Jennifer lingered behind. Margaret, is everything okay? You seem different today. Different how? I don't know. Distracted maybe. And you're smiling more than usual. Jennifer's expression grew concerned. Did something happen last night? Margaret considered how to answer. Jennifer had been her assistant for 2 years and had seen her through some of her darkest moments after the accident. She'd also witnessed the gradual shutdown of Margaret's personal life, the way work had consumed everything until there was nothing left. I had a good evening, Margaret said carefully. Really good evening. Jennifer's eyes widened. The blind date? Sarah's been texting me all morning wanting details. She said the guy never showed up, but then you never called her back either. He showed up, Margaret said, unable to suppress another smile. Just not the way any of us expected. Before Jennifer could ask for more details, Margaret's phone rang. Her mother's sister Evelyn, who called every week to check in and subtly inquire about Margaret's love life. Aunt Evelyn, Margaret answered, still smiling. Margaret, darling, you sound cheerful. That's unusual for a Tuesday morning. Margaret laughed. Her aunt had never been one for subtlety. I had a nice evening yesterday. Oh, do tell. Please say it involved a man who isn't intimidated by successful women. It involved a man who isn't intimidated by anything, as far as I can tell, Margaret replied. His name is Alex, and he owns an auto shop in Brooklyn. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had dropped. An auto shop, Evelyn repeated finally. In Brooklyn? Yes. And this is the man who made you sound happy for the first time in 3 years? Yes. Another pause. When do I meet him? Margaret felt a rush of affection for her aunt, who had never once suggested that Margaret's standards might need adjusting or that she should be grateful for any attention at all. Evelyn had been furious when Margaret's fiancé, Left, had shown up at the hospital with enough flowers to supply a funeral home and had spent the last 3 years insisting that the right man would come along when Margaret was ready. Soon, I hope, Margaret said, if things go well. They will, Evelyn said with the confidence of someone who had been married to the same man for 43 years. I can hear it in your voice. You sound like yourself again." After ending the call, Margaret sat quietly in her office, looking out at the city and thinking about Evelyn's words. She did feel like herself again, but not the self she'd been trying so hard to reconstruct after her accident. She felt like the person she'd been before success and tragedy had taught her to be careful, calculated, and constantly performing. Her lunch with the Patterson Group was a disaster. She found herself questioning their campaign strategy, suggesting they focus on authenticity rather than aspiration, and generally behaving like someone who cared more about truth than profit. The clients left looking confused and vaguely offended. "Margaret," Marcus cornered her after the meeting, "what's going on? The Patterson Group has been our client for 3 years, and you just basically told them their entire brand identity is morally questionable." "Isn't it?" Margaret asked. "They're selling diet pills to teenage girls, Marcus. When did we become okay with that?" Marcus stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "Since they started paying us 6 figures annually to help them do it effectively." "Margaret, this isn't like you. You're the one who always says business is business." Margaret realized he was right. She had always said that. She'd built her reputation on being pragmatic, results-oriented, willing to separate personal feelings from professional success. When had she become someone who put profit above people? When her parents died, probably. When the weight of keeping their company alive had made every decision a calculation rather than a choice. When her accident had made her feel like she had to work twice as hard to prove she was still valuable. "Maybe it's time I started acting more like myself," Margaret said quietly. The quarterly review meeting that afternoon was an exercise in cognitive dissonance. Margaret sat through presentations about market penetration and brand awareness while thinking about Alex's hands fixing someone's engine, about Tony's wife, Rosa cooking with love, about the difference between making a living and making a life. By 5 o'clock, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. She was packing up her briefcase when her phone buzzed. "Alex, how was your day? Still on for tonight?" Margaret realized she'd been looking forward to this text all day. Day was complicated. "Tonight can't come soon enough. Where should I meet you?" "Alex, I was thinking I could pick you up at your office. I'd like to see where the magic happens." Margaret looked around her sterile, expensive office and wondered what Alex would make of it. The thought of him in this space, with his honest work clothes and genuine smile, made her see it through different eyes. When had her office become a monument to isolation rather than achievement? "Margaret, address is 200 Park Avenue, 32nd floor. Fair warning, it's very corporate." "Alex, I'll try not to let it intimidate me. See you at 6? Margaret, perfect. Margaret spent the next hour trying to focus on email, but mostly just watching the clock. At 5:55, Jennifer knocked on her door. "There's a man here to see you," she said, with barely contained curiosity. "Says his name is Alex Rodriguez. He's very charming." Margaret wheeled out to the reception area and found Alex standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city view. He'd cleaned up since the night before, crisp jeans, a navy button-down shirt that brought out his eyes work boots that were clearly his best pair. He looked handsome and slightly out of place, like he belonged in a more honest world than the one she'd built around herself. "Wow," he said when he saw her. "This is impressive. I can see why you're so successful." "It's just an office," Margaret replied, but she found herself seeing the space through his eyes, the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the view that cost more per square foot than most people's entire homes. "Just an office," Alex repeated with a smile. "Right, and the Sistine Chapel is just a ceiling." Several of her colleagues were finding excuses to walk through the reception area, clearly curious about the handsome stranger who'd come to collect their famously private CEO. Margaret realized she didn't care about their speculation or their judgment. For the first time in her professional life, her personal happiness felt more important than managing appearances. "Ready to go?" she asked. "More than ready," Alex replied, offering her his arm. "I have big plans for us tonight." As they waited for the elevator, Margaret caught sight of their reflection in the polished steel doors. They looked like they came from different worlds, Her in her tailored business suit and designer jewelry, him in his carefully chosen casual clothes. But somehow, they also looked right together. "Can I ask you something?" Alex said as the elevator descended. "Of course." "Does any of this?" He gestured around the elevator, presumably meaning her office, her success, her world, "actually make you happy?" The question hit her like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so perceptive. Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her happiness rather than her achievements. "I thought it did," she said honestly. "For a long time, success felt like enough. It felt like proof that I was still valuable, still worth something after." She gestured vaguely at her chair. "And now I'm wondering if I've been climbing the wrong mountain all along." The elevator opened onto the parking garage, and Alex guided her toward his Camaro. "You know what I think?" he said, as he helped her into the passenger seat. "What?" "I think you've been so busy proving you're not broken that you forgot to check if you're actually living." The observation was so accurate, it took Margaret's breath away. That was exactly what she'd been doing, performing competence, demonstrating value, showing the world that her accident hadn't diminished her worth. But somewhere in all that proving, she'd stopped asking herself what she actually wanted. "Where are we going?" she asked as Alex started the car. "Brooklyn," he said with a grin. "I want to show you my world. Fair warning, it's very authentic." The drive to Brooklyn gave them time to decompress from the corporate atmosphere. Alex told her about his day, a classic Mustang that needed a complete engine rebuild, a regular customer whose teenage daughter was learning to drive and needed her brakes checked, the ongoing battle with his landlord about updating the shop's electrical system. "It sounds like you really care about your customers," Margaret observed. "They're not just customers," Alex replied. "Mrs. Chen has been bringing her car to the shop since my dad opened it. I watched her kids grow up. When her husband died last year, we made sure her car was always running perfectly because it's how she gets to work, to the grocery store, to everything that keeps her life going." Margaret thought about her own clients, faceless corporations with profit margins she optimized and brand awareness she maximized. When had she stopped thinking about the actual people affected by her work? "That's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's just being human," Alex replied. "Caring about the people in your life." They pulled up in front of a modest storefront with Rodriguez Auto Shop painted in fading letters across the front window. Through the glass, Margaret could see several cars in various states of repair, tools hanging neatly on pegboards, and photographs covering one wall. "This is it," Alex said, pride evident in his voice. "Want to come in? I know it's not much compared to what you're used to." "Alex," Margaret interrupted gently. "Stop apologizing for who you are. This is exactly what I want to see." The shop smelled like motor oil and metal polish, honest scents that spoke of real work being done. Alex wheeled her around, explaining the different projects, introducing her to his 2 employees who were working late. Miguel, a young man who was clearly being groomed to take over more responsibility, and Frank, an older mechanic who'd worked with Alex's father. "This is Margaret," Alex said proudly. "Margaret, meet the best mechanics in Brooklyn. Pleasure to meet you." "Miss," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag before shaking hers. "Alex hasn't stopped talking about you all day. Thought he was making you up." "Frank," Alex protested, but he was smiling. "It's true," Miguel chimed in. "He's been walking around here like he won the lottery. Must have been some date." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. The easy camaraderie between the men, the way they teased Alex with obvious affection, the pride they all took in their work. It was so different from her sterile corporate environment. "Can I see the wall of pictures?" she asked, nodding toward the collection of photographs. Alex's expression grew soft. "Those are Dad's legacy photos. Every car we've restored, every family car we've kept running, every customer who became part of our extended family." The photographs told the story of 3 decades of honest work, before and after shots of restored classics, family photos of customers with their newly repaired cars, snapshots of neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties, where the Rodriguez family had clearly been honored guests. "This is incredible," Margaret breathed, studying a photo of a young Alex standing next to his father beside a beautifully restored 1955 Chevy. "You're not just fixing cars, you're preserving memories, keeping families mobile, maintaining pieces of history." "Never thought about it that way," Alex said, but his eyes were bright with pleasure at her understanding. "Maybe you should," Margaret replied. "Maybe people need to know that places like this still exist, that there are still businesses that care more about service than profit." Alex looked at her curiously. "You sound like you have ideas." Margaret felt something click into place in her mind, a possibility she'd never considered before. "What if I told you there was a way to help more people find businesses like yours? What if there was a way to make sure places that prioritize community and quality could compete with the big chains?" "I'd say you're talking about marketing, and I can't afford marketing," Alex replied honestly. "What if you didn't have to afford it? What if someone wanted to help because it was the right thing to do?" Alex studied her face carefully. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" Before she could answer, a car pulled up outside, a beat-up Honda with smoke coming from under the hood. A young woman got out, looking panicked. "Alex," she called as she hurried into the shop. "My car started smoking on the way home from work. I can't afford for it to die. I just started a new job and—" "Hey, calm down, Elena," Alex said gently, moving toward the woman. "Let's take a look and see what's going on. Miguel, can you grab the diagnostic equipment?" Margaret watched as Alex and his team sprang into action, not to maximize profit, but to solve a problem for someone who clearly couldn't afford a major repair. They diagnosed the issue, a blown radiator hose, and had it fixed within 20 minutes, charging Elena exactly what the part cost. "You're not charging for labor?" Margaret asked quietly. "Elena's putting herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs, Alex replied. "Sometimes keeping someone's car running is more important than making a buck." Margaret felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what success actually meant. Here was a man who measured his worth not in profit margins, but in problems solved, not in market share, but in lives made easier. "Alex," she said as Elena drove away with tears of gratitude in her eyes, "what would you say if I told you I wanted to change careers?" Alex's eyebrows shot up. "I'd say that's a pretty big decision to make after one date." "Not because of you," Margaret clarified quickly. "Because of me. Because watching you work, seeing how you care about people, it's made me realize I've been spending my energy on the wrong things." "What would you want to do instead?" Margaret looked around the shop, at the photographs documenting decades of honest work, at Miguel carefully organizing tools for tomorrow's projects, at Frank sweeping up, even though his shift had officially ended hours ago. "I want to help businesses like this," she said with growing certainty. "Real businesses that care about their communities. I want to use my skills to make sure places like this can survive and thrive." Alex was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "That would mean walking away from everything you've built. Would it? Or would it mean finally building something that matters?" As they locked up the shop and headed to dinner, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since her accident, she was thinking about her future in terms of possibility rather than limitation. The restaurant Alex chose was a small, family-owned Italian place where the owner's grandmother still made pasta by hand in the front window. They were seated at a checkered tablecloth table that had probably been there since the 1970s, surrounded by the warm chaos of families sharing meals and celebrating small occasions. "So," Alex said after they'd ordered, "tell me more about this career change idea. Are you serious?" Margaret considered the question. 24 hours ago, the idea of leaving her successful firm would have seemed impossible. Now, it felt inevitable. "I think I am," she said slowly. "I've been successful by every conventional measure, but I can't remember the last time I went home feeling like I'd actually helped someone. Today, watching you with Elena, seeing how your work directly improves people's lives, I want that." "It's not as glamorous as what you do now," Alex warned. "The money's not as good, the recognition is basically non-existent, and some days you go home exhausted and covered in grease. But you go home satisfied," Margaret observed. "You go home knowing you matter." Alex's smile was soft and proud. Yeah, I do. I want to matter too, Alex. Not just to shareholders or profit margins, but to real people with real problems. As they talked through dinner, about her ideas for helping small businesses, about his dreams for expanding the shop, about the possibility of building something meaningful together, Margaret realized this was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not two people trying to impress each other, but two people inspiring each other to become better versions of themselves. There's something I need to tell you, Alex said as they shared a cannoli for dessert. Margaret's heart skipped. Okay, I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. I know it's only been 2 days and I know it's probably too soon to say it, but I need you to know. The way you see possibilities, the way you care about doing the right thing, the way you make me want to be better. I'm falling hard and fast and I wanted you to know where I stand. The honesty in his voice took Margaret's breath away. In her previous relationship, love had been strategic, discussed like a business merger, analyzed for compatibility and mutual benefit. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of love her parents had shared, the kind that made them partners in everything. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered, reaching across the table to take his hand. It terrifies me and thrills me and makes me feel more alive than I have in years. Alex brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. So, what do we do now? Margaret looked around the restaurant, at the families laughing around nearby tables, at the grandmother still making pasta in the window despite her obvious exhaustion, at the simple joy of people sharing food and conversation, and knew exactly what she wanted to do. Now we figure out how to build a life together, she said. A real life, not a performance of success, but something authentic and meaningful and ours. That sounds perfect, Alex replied, his smile lighting up his entire face. Absolutely perfect. As they drove back to Manhattan that night, Margaret felt like she was seeing her city with new eyes. The bright lights and towering buildings that had once represented achievement now seemed like beautiful possibilities, platforms from which to do good work, to help real people, to build something that mattered. Alex, she said as they pulled up in front of her building. Yeah? Thank you. For what? For seeing me. For making me remember who I really am underneath all the armor I've been wearing. Alex leaned over and kissed her softly, a kiss full of promise and possibility, and the kind of love that changes everything. Thank you for being brave enough to let me see, he replied. As Margaret rode the elevator up to her apartment that night, she was already planning how to wind down her involvement with clients who didn't align with her values, planning how to use her skills to help businesses like Alex's, planning a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined, but everything like what she wanted. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Sullivan was excited about tomorrow, and for the first time in her life, she was building towards something that felt like home. 3 weeks after that transformative dinner at the Italian restaurant, Margaret found herself sitting in her office at 7 in the morning, staring at a resignation letter she'd rewritten 6 times. Each version felt too corporate, too cold for what was essentially a declaration of independence from everything she'd built her identity around. Her phone buzzed with Alex's morning text. Good luck today, beautiful. Remember, you're not losing anything. You're gaining everything that matters. Margaret smiled, feeling the familiar flutter of warmth that came with every message from him. In 3 weeks, he'd become her anchor, her compass and her courage all rolled into one. But more than that, he'd become her partner in reimagining what success could look like. The door to her office opened, and Jennifer entered with coffee, and that concerned expression she'd been wearing more frequently lately. Margaret, the board meeting is in an hour, Jennifer said carefully. Are you sure you want to do this today? Maybe we could postpone. No postponing, Margaret replied firmly. I've been postponing this conversation with myself for 3 years. It's time. What Jennifer didn't know, what no one in the office knew, was that Margaret had spent the last 2 weeks quietly transitioning her responsibilities, ensuring her clients would be well served by other team members, and setting up a plan that would benefit everyone involved. She wasn't abandoning ship. She was carefully, strategically, stepping into a new life. The board meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor. with a view of Manhattan that had once filled Margaret with pride and now just reminded her of how removed she'd become from real life. The 12 board members, mostly men in expensive suits who'd known her parents, sat around the polished table with the kind of patient attention reserved for quarterly reports. "Thank you all for making time for this meeting," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have an announcement that will surprise you, but I hope you'll understand that it comes from a place of deep consideration and growth." Board Chairman William Hartwell, who'd been her father's closest friend, leaned forward with interest. "Of course, Margaret, what's on your mind?" Margaret took a breath, thinking of Alex's encouraging smile, of Eleanor's gratitude when her car was fixed, of Tony's pride in his wife's recipes. "I'm resigning as CEO of Sullivan and Associates, effective in 60 days. The silence that followed was deafening. Several board members exchanged glances that ranged from shocked to concerned to calculating. "Margaret," William said carefully, "this is very sudden. Is this about your health, your accident? Because we've always been supportive." "This has nothing to do with my disability," Margaret interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "This has everything to do with my values. I've realized that the work we do here, while profitable and professionally successful, doesn't align with who I want to be or how I want to spend my life." Board member Patricia Chen, the only other woman at the table, spoke next. "Margaret, you've built something extraordinary here. Your leadership has increased our revenue by 40% in 2 years. Why would you walk away from that?" "Because revenue isn't the only measure of success," Margaret replied. "I want to use my skills to help businesses that prioritize community service over profit maximization. I want to work with people who measure success by problems solved rather than dollars earned." The questions came rapidly after that. Concerns about the transition, about her mental state, about whether this was a temporary crisis or a permanent decision. Margaret answered them all calmly, professionally, with the same competence she'd always brought to her role. But underneath her composed exterior, she felt liberated in a way she hadn't experienced since before her parents' death. "I have a transition plan," she concluded, sliding copies of a detailed document across the table. "Marcus has proven himself ready for increased leadership responsibility, and I'm recommending him for the CEO position. I'll stay for 60 days to ensure a smooth handover, and I'm prepared to serve as a consultant during the adjustment period." After the board members filed out, some supportive, others clearly concerned about the company's future without her, William lingered behind. "Margaret," he said gently, "your parents would be proud of what you've accomplished here. Are you sure you want to throw that away?" Margaret considered his words carefully. "Uncle William, my parents built this company because they believed in excellence and service, but somewhere along the way, we lost the service part. We became so focused on excellence that we forgot about purpose." She paused, meeting his eyes. "I think they'd be prouder of me for remembering what really matters." William studied her face for a long moment, then smiled. "You know what? I think you're right. You look happier than you have since the accident, Margaret. More like yourself." "I feel like myself again," Margaret admitted. "For the first time in a long time." That evening, Margaret met Alex at his shop, where he was working late on a restoration project, a 1965 Mustang that belonged to a customer's recently deceased father. The man couldn't afford a full restoration, but Alex was determined to get the car running so it could be driven at the customer's wedding next month. "How did it go?" Alex asked, looking up from the engine bay, his face streaked with grease but his eyes full of concern and support. "I'm officially unemployed in 60 days, Margaret announced. Alex's wrench clattered to the floor. "You actually did it?" "I actually did it." Alex crossed the garage in 3 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her chair and all, his joy infectious and overwhelming. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered against her hair. "I know how hard that must have been." "It was terrifying and liberating and exactly right," Margaret replied, holding him tight. "Now I just have to figure out what comes next." "We figure out what comes next," Alex corrected. "Together." Over the following weeks, as Margaret worked through her transition period, she and Alex began planning their future with the kind of strategic thinking she'd once reserved for business deals, but now applied to building a life. They spent evenings at her apartment, which Alex initially found intimidating but gradually grew comfortable in, and weekends at his family's house in Brooklyn, where his mother Isabella fed them enormous meals and his sister Sophia grilled Margaret about her intentions toward her brother. "So you really left your fancy job for Alex?" Sophia asked one Sunday. That afternoon, while they watched him and his nephew Danny work on a go-kart in the garage. "I left my job for me," Margaret corrected gently. "Alex just helped me remember who I really am underneath all the corporate armor." Sophia studied her for a moment, then grinned. "Good answer. You'll fit in fine around here." Margaret had also introduced Alex to her Aunt Evelyn, who had taken one look at him and declared him exactly what Margaret needed. A man who wasn't intimidated by her success, but also wasn't impressed by it in the wrong ways. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting woman in the world," Evelyn had observed after their first dinner together. "Not the most successful, not the most accomplished, just the most interesting. That's how your uncle looked at me for 43 years. As Margaret's final day at Sullivan & Associates approached, she felt both nervous and excited about the future. She'd incorporated a new consulting firm, Sullivan Community Partners, focused exclusively on helping small community-minded businesses develop sustainable marketing strategies. Her first client was already lined up, Rodriguez Auto Shop. "Are you sure about this?" Alex asked the night before her transition became official. They were sitting in his apartment above the shop, sharing takeout Chinese food and planning her new office space in the empty room next to his workshop. "About leaving corporate life or about going into business with my boyfriend?" Margaret asked with a smile. "Both, I guess. This is all happening pretty fast." Margaret set down her chopsticks and took his hands. "Alex, 3 months ago, I was going through the motions of a life that looked successful but felt empty. I was convinced that no one could love me as I am, that the best I could hope for was someone who'd settle for damaged goods." Her voice grew stronger. "Now I'm sitting in an apartment above an auto shop with a man who makes me laugh. Every day planning a business that will actually help people, feeling more like myself than I have since before my accident. Yes, it's fast, but when you know something is right, why wait?" Alex's smile was radiant. "In that case, I have something to ask you." Margaret's heart skipped as Alex reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. But instead of dropping to one knee, he set the box on the coffee table between them and took her hands. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his voice slightly shaky with nerves. "6 months ago, I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life fixing other people's cars and going home alone to frozen dinners and baseball games. I thought love was something that happened to other people, people who were smoother or richer or just plain luckier than me." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "Then you rolled into my life, literally, and changed everything. You made me want to be better, to build something bigger, to take risks I never thought I was brave enough for." Alex opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "I'm not rich. I don't have a fancy education, and I'll probably always have grease under my fingernails. But I love you completely, exactly as you are, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Will you marry me?" Margaret stared at the ring, not because she was hesitating, but because she was overwhelmed by the completeness of the moment. This wasn't the carefully orchestrated proposal she'd once imagined for herself in an expensive restaurant with a ring that cost more than most people's cars. This was real and honest and perfect. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." Alex's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like everything else about them together. "There's something else," Alex said, his voice still emotional. "I've been thinking about what you said, about expanding the business, about helping other shops like ours. What if we did more than just marketing? What if we created a whole network?" Margaret looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we started a cooperative? Small, community-focused auto shops that share resources, training, best practices. Places that prioritize service over profit, but are still financially sustainable." Alex's eyes were bright with possibility. "We could help shops like Dad's survive and thrive, train young mechanics, provide affordable car care to people who need it most." Margaret felt that familiar flutter of excitement that came with a genuinely good idea. Alex, that's brilliant. We could provide marketing support, business training, even group purchasing power for parts and equipment. Exactly. And the first location could be here, but improved, expanded. A training center, as well as a working shop. As they talked through the night, planning and dreaming and building something together that was bigger than either of them alone, Margaret realized this was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not two people trying to impress each other or maintain separate identities, but two people creating something new and better together. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the renovated Rodriguez Auto Shop and Community Training Center, watching Alex demonstrate proper brake maintenance to a group of young mechanics from across Brooklyn. The wall, that had once held only customer photos, now showcased the 12 shops that had joined their cooperative, the dozens of young people they'd trained, and the hundreds of families whose cars they'd kept running affordably. Her own consulting firm had grown beyond her wildest expectations, not because she was chasing profit, but because word had spread about a marketing consultant who actually cared about her clients' missions rather than just their bottom lines. She worked with community, gardens, family restaurants, immigrant-owned businesses, and a dozen other organizations that made their neighborhoods better rather than just richer. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex announced to the training group, I'd like you to meet my wife Margaret, who's going to talk to you about the business side of running an ethical auto shop. Margaret smiled at the word wife, still getting used to the title after their small wedding 2 months earlier. They'd been married in the backyard of Alex's family home. Surrounded by the community they'd both learned to value above everything else. The most important thing to remember, Margaret told the trainees, is that you're not just fixing cars, you're keeping families mobile, helping people get to work, ensuring that transportation never becomes a barrier to someone's success. When you approach your work that way, the business success follows naturally. After the training session ended, Margaret and Alex walked hand through the neighborhood, past Tony's diner where they still had dinner at least once a week, past the community garden that had become one of Margaret's favorite clients, past the elementary school where Alex volunteered teaching kids basic car maintenance. Any regrets? Alex asked, a question that had become their weekly check-in with each other. Only that it took me so long to get here, Margaret replied honestly. What about you? I regret that I almost chickened out of meeting you that night, Alex said with a grin. But everything else, no regrets at all. They'd reached the small park by the river where Alex had first told Margaret he was falling in love with her. The bench where they'd sat was still there, now with a small plaque reading, where Margaret and Alex decided to build something beautiful together. Alex's surprise anniversary gift to her. Can I tell you something? Margaret said, as they sat down in their special spot. Always. That night when Richard stood me up, I was so angry and humiliated. I kept thinking it was confirmation that nobody would ever want me, that my accident had made me somehow less worthy of love. Alex squeezed her hand. And now? Now I realized that getting stood up was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because if Richard had shown up, if he'd been the kind of man who went through with dates out of obligation, I never would have met you. I never would have discovered what it feels like to be loved exactly as I am. Margaret looked across the water at the Manhattan skyline, the buildings where she'd once worked gleaming in the evening light. They looked beautiful from this distance, but she felt no longing to return to that world. I used to think success meant climbing higher than everyone else, she continued. Now I know it means building something that lifts other people up too. Alex brought her hand to his lips and kissed her wedding ring, the simple band they'd chosen together, engraved with the words "building beautiful things together." I love you, Margaret Rodriguez, he said, still sounding slightly amazed by their shared last name. I love you too, Alex Rodriguez, she replied. Thank you for seeing me before I remembered how to see myself. As the sun set over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. The accident that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The failed blind date had led to the love of her life. The successful career she'd walked away from had prepared her for work that actually mattered. What are you thinking about? Alex asked, noticing her contemplative expression. I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be redirections toward the best things, Margaret replied. I'm thinking about how love really does find us when we least expect it, but most need it. Dad, and I'm thinking about how lucky I am that you decided to approach a stranger's table in a fancy restaurant, even though you had no reason to think she'd want your company. Alex laughed, the sound echoing across the water. I had every reason to think you'd want my company. You just didn't know it yet. As they sat there together, watching the lights come on across the city, Margaret felt the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life you were meant to live. 3 years ago, Margaret Sullivan had been a successful CEO in a wheelchair who believed her greatest accomplishments were behind her. Tonight, Margaret Rodriguez was a woman who had learned that true success isn't about what you achieve for yourself, but what you create that makes the world a little bit better. And it had all started with a blind date disaster that turned out to be the beginning of everything beautiful. The mechanic who had walked into her life had given her more than love. He had given her back herself, and in return, she had given him not just her heart, but her partnership in building something that mattered. Together, they had created a life that was authentic, meaningful, and exactly what both of them had been searching for without knowing it. Sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst dates. Sometimes the most successful partnerships start with the most unlikely meetings. Sometimes the greatest transformations come disguised as the worst disasters. Margaret and Alex had learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be the best version of yourself and who loves you completely while you figure out who that person is. As they drove home through the streets of Brooklyn, past the businesses they'd helped, through the community they'd chosen, toward the life they'd built. Together, Margaret realized she had never been happier to be exactly who she was. Wheelchair and all, dreams and all, love and all. The blind date disaster had ended up being the best thing that ever happened to both of them. And every day since had been proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories start with the most unexpected beginnings. The end.